Welcome back to another chilling episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. On a crisp September morning in 1922, a teenage boy's morning walk in New Brunswick, New Jersey, turned into a nightmare when he discovered two bodies beneath a crabapple tree. The victims? A prominent Episcopal minister and his choir singer. What followed was a scandalous tale of forbidden love, wealth, and privilege that would captivate the nation. The carefully arranged bodies, scattered love letters, and brutal nature of the crimes would lead investigators down a path of corruption, cover-ups, and class warfare in what became known as the Hall Mills murder case. Let's dive into one of the most sensational unsolved murders of the 1920s. On the morning of September 16, 1922, a teenage boy walking along DeRussey's Lane in New Brunswick, New Jersey, made a discovery that would shake the community to its core and spark one of the most sensational murder cases of the 1920s. There, beneath a crabapple tree, lay the bodies of Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall and Eleanor Mills, positioned side by side in a scene that appeared to have been deliberately arranged. The Reverend Hall was a prominent Episcopal minister at St. John the Evangelist Church, known throughout New Brunswick for his charismatic sermons and respected position in society. Eleanor Mills was a member of his choir and the wife of James Mills, the church sexton. Both victims had been shot, with Eleanor's throat brutally slashed, and their love letters scattered around their bodies like macabre confetti. The positioning of the bodies spoke volumes to investigators. The Reverend and Mrs. Mills were found lying on their backs, their feet pointing toward the crabapple tree. Hall's right arm was positioned across his chest, while his hat had been placed over his face. Eleanor's throat had been cut ear to ear with such violence that her tongue had been severed and placed between her teeth. 3 bullets had been fired into her head, while Reverend Hall had been shot once through the temple. What made the scene even more disturbing was the careful arrangement of love letters between the pair, spread around their bodies. These letters, passionate and intimate in nature, revealed a long-standing affair between the 41-year-old minister and his 34-year-old choir singer. One letter read, "My one great longing is to be with you and to be worthy of you in every way." The revelation of their relationship would soon transform a murder investigation into a scandal that captivated the nation. The victims had last been seen alive on the evening of September 14th, when they left their respective homes, presumably to meet each other. Eleanor had told her husband she was going to the pharmacy, while Reverend Hall informed his wife, Frances, that he had church business to attend to. Neither would return home that night. Frances Hall, the Reverend's widow, came from the prestigious Stevens family and had brought considerable wealth to their marriage. She lived with her 2 brothers, Willie and Henry Stevens, and an eccentric cousin named Henry de la Bruyere Carpenter, in a mansion on Nickel Avenue. The Stevens family's influence in New Brunswick was substantial, and their wealth would soon play a crucial role in the investigation that followed. The initial police response to the murders was remarkably inadequate by modern standards. The crime scene was compromised almost immediately as crowds of curious onlookers trampled through the area, picking up potential evidence as souvenirs. The local authorities, seemingly overwhelmed by the high-profile nature of the case, failed to secure the scene properly or collect crucial forensic evidence. James Mills, Eleanor's husband, identified his wife's body at the scene. His reaction was surprisingly subdued, later telling reporters, "I knew she was running around with the minister." This statement would be the first of many revelations that would expose the complex web of relationships and tensions within the church community. The autopsy revealed that both victims had been killed where they were found, with no signs of their bodies being moved after death. The medical examiner noted that Eleanor Mills had been killed first, with Reverend Hall likely witnessing her murder before being shot himself. The severity of Eleanor's wounds, particularly the mutilation of her throat and tongue, suggested a crime of passion, possibly fueled by rage and jealousy. As news of the murders spread, the national press descended upon New Brunswick. The case had all the elements that sold newspapers: sex, religion, class conflict, and violence. The New York Daily News dubbed it "The Minister and the Choir Singer," while other papers focused on the salacious details revealed in the love letters found at the scene. The investigation quickly focused on two possible motives: jealousy over the affair or an attempt to protect the reputation of the wealthy Stevens family. Frances Hall and her brothers became persons of interest, particularly after witnesses came forward with accounts of seeing a woman matching Frances's description near De Rossi's Lane on the night of the murders. One key witness was Pearl Balmer, who lived near the murder scene. She claimed to have heard gunshots and women scream on the night of September 14th. More significantly, she reported seeing a car with its headlights off, driving slowly along the lane. This testimony would later become crucial as investigators tried to piece together the events of that fatal night. The case took an interesting turn when investigators learned that Frances Hall had hired private detectives to follow her husband in the months leading up to his death. These detectives had documented the affair between Reverend Hall and Eleanor Mills, providing detailed reports to Frances about their meetings and interactions. This revelation suggested that Frances had been well aware of her husband's infidelity, raising questions about her potential motive for murder. Meanwhile, the Stevens brothers' involvement became increasingly suspicious. Willie Stevens, described by many as eccentric and unstable, was known to carry a pistol and had allegedly made threatening statements about Reverend Hall in the past. Henry Stevens, the more reserved of the brothers, had been seen in the area on the night of the murders by multiple witnesses. The investigation was further complicated by the social and economic dynamics at play. The Stevens family's wealth and influence in New Brunswick created an immediate imbalance in how the case was handled. They hired the best lawyers available and seemed to have an unusual degree of influence over the local authorities. By contrast, Eleanor Mills came from a working-class background, and her husband James lacked the resources to push for a more thorough investigation. This disparity would become a recurring theme in the press coverage, with many newspapers portraying the case as a clash between New Brunswick's social classes. As weeks turned into months, the investigation seemed to stall. Despite the sensational nature of the crime and the abundant newspaper coverage, solid evidence remained elusive. The murder weapons were never found, and many potential witnesses either changed their stories or refused to cooperate with authorities. The first real break in the case came when Charlotte Mills, Eleanor's daughter, came forward with new information. She claimed to have seen her mother writing letters to Reverend Hall on the day of her death, and more importantly, she provided details about her mother's relationship with the minister that helped establish a timeline of events leading up to the murders. The investigation took a dramatic turn when a woman named Jane Gibson emerged as a key witness. Known locally as the Pig Woman because she raised pigs on her small farm near the murder scene, Gibson claimed to have witnessed the murders while riding her mule, Henry, on the night of September 14th. Her testimony would become one of the most controversial aspects of the case. According to Gibson, she had been investigating suspicious noises on her property when she saw a group of people beneath the crabapple tree. She claimed to have recognized Frances Hall, Willie Stevens, and Henry Stevens among them. In her account, she witnessed the confrontation and subsequent shootings, though her story would change in various tellings over the years. The emergence of Jane Gibson as a witness reignited public interest in the case. However, her credibility was immediately questioned. Her reputation as an eccentric figure, combined with inconsistencies in her various statements, made prosecutors wary of relying too heavily on her testimony. Nevertheless, her account provided investigators with new leads to pursue. In 1926, 4 years after the murders, the case suddenly sprang back to life. A new witness came forward claiming to have seen Frances Hall and her brothers near the murder scene on the night in question. This testimony, combined with renewed public pressure and changes in the local political landscape, led to the arrest of Frances Hall, Willie Stevens, Henry Stevens, and their cousin Henry Carpenter. The trial that followed became one of the most sensational legal proceedings of the 1920s. Held in Somerville, New Jersey, it drew thousands of spectators and hundreds of reporters from across the country. The courtroom was packed daily, with spectators fighting for seats to witness what newspapers dubbed the trial of the century. The prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. They presented the love letters found at the crime scene, which established the affair between Reverend Hall and Eleanor Mills. They also brought forward witnesses who claimed to have seen the defendants near DeRussey's Lane on the night of the murders. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came when Jane Gibson testified. By this time, she was seriously ill and had to be brought to court in a hospital bed, which was placed in the courtroom. Her testimony, while compelling in its detail, was effectively dismantled by the defense team's aggressive cross-examination, which highlighted the numerous inconsistencies in her various accounts of the night. The defense, funded by the Stevens family fortune, assembled an impressive team of lawyers who methodically attacked the prosecution's case. They questioned the reliability of witness testimonies, presented alibis for the defendants, and suggested alternative theories for the murders. They particularly focused on James Mills, Eleanor's husband, suggesting he had more motivation for the murders than their clients. Frances Hall's attorneys portrayed her as a dignified woman who, despite her husband's infidelity, had maintained her composure and dignity. They argued that if she had known about the affair and wanted revenge, she had had plenty of opportunities before the night of September 14th. The defense also emphasized the lack of physical evidence linking any of the defendants to the crimes. Willie Stevens, whose mental stability had been questioned throughout the investigation, proved to be a sympathetic figure during the trial. His obvious cognitive challenges and childlike demeanor made it difficult for many jurors to believe he could have participated in such a calculated murder plot. The prosecution's case was further weakened by the poor initial police work. The contaminated crime scene, lost evidence, and 4-year delay in bringing charges all worked in the defendant's favor. Many crucial pieces of evidence that might have sealed the case had been lost or compromised in the immediate aftermath of the murders. The trial lasted for several weeks, with testimony from dozens of witnesses. The press coverage was extensive, with newspapers across the country providing daily updates on the proceedings. The case became a symbol of the changing social mores of the 1920s, touching on themes of adultery, class privilege, and justice. As the trial neared its conclusion, the prosecution's case appeared increasingly weak. The circumstantial nature of the evidence, combined with the defense's effective strategy of creating reasonable doubt, seemed to sway the jury. After 36 days of testimony and 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. All defendants were found not guilty. The announcement was met with mixed reactions from the packed courtroom and the public at large. While supporters of the Stevens family celebrated, others saw the verdict as evidence that wealth and social status could indeed influence the course of justice. Frances Hall returned to her mansion on Nickel Avenue, where she would live out the remainder of her days in relative seclusion. She never remarried and maintained her innocence until her death in 1942. The Stevens brothers also returned to their privileged lives, though the scandal would forever attach to their family name. The aftermath of the trial left many questions unanswered. If Frances Hall and her brothers weren't responsible for the murders, then who was? The case remained officially unsolved, joining the ranks of America's most infamous cold cases. Various theories would emerge over the years, but none would ever be conclusively proven. James Mills, Eleanor's widower, largely disappeared from public view after the trial. He had remained a peripheral figure throughout the proceedings, his working-class status and lack of resources limiting his ability to influence the investigation or pursue justice for his wife. The Hall Mills murder case left an indelible mark on New Brunswick and American criminal justice history. The acquittal of Frances Hall and her brothers highlighted growing concerns about the influence of wealth and social status in the judicial system. In the years following the trial, several investigators and journalists would continue to probe the case, uncovering new details and perspectives that had been overlooked during the initial investigation. One particularly intriguing development came in 1930 when a former New Brunswick police officer came forward with information he had withheld during the investigation. He claimed to have seen a group of people in a dark sedan near De Russey's Lane on the night of the murders, but had been pressured by his superiors to remain silent. While this information couldn't be verified, it added to the growing body of evidence suggesting that local authorities had been influenced by the Stevens family's prominence. The murder scene itself became a macabre tourist attraction in the years following the trial. The crabapple tree where the bodies were found drew countless visitors, many of whom carved their initials into its trunk or took pieces of bark as souvenirs. The tree eventually died in the 1930s, possibly due to this constant attention, but its location remained a point of interest for true crime enthusiasts for decades to come. Charlotte Mills, Eleanor's daughter, wrote a memoir in the 1940s that shed new light on her mother's relationship with Reverend Hall. According to her account, the affair had begun several years before the murders, when Eleanor began taking private singing lessons from the Reverend. Charlotte described watching her mother transform from a resigned, unhappy wife into someone who seemed to have found new purpose in life, albeit through a relationship that would ultimately lead to her death. The love letters found at the crime scene, which had played such a crucial role in the investigation and trial, revealed a depth of passion that seemed at odds with the public personas of both Reverend Hall and Eleanor Mills. In one particularly poignant letter, Eleanor had written, "My soul reaches out to you across the darkness, seeking the light of your love." These letters would later be studied by historians not only for their relevance to the crime, but as documents that captured the social and emotional constraints of their era. Further investigation into Willie Stevens's background revealed a more complex character than the simple-minded man presented at trial. While he did have cognitive challenges, several acquaintances later testified that he was capable of surprising insight and calculation when it suited him. One former servant of the Stevens household claimed that Willie had once demonstrated remarkable tactical thinking when planning a business venture, suggesting that his apparent simplicity might have been, at least partially, an act. The role of Henry de la Bruyere Carpenter, the Stevens cousin who had been charged alongside Frances and her brothers, remained particularly mysterious. As a member of the extended Stevens family, he had access to their resources and social connections, but his exact involvement in the events surrounding the murders was never fully explained. Some investigators believed he might have played a larger role than initially suspected, possibly serving as an intermediary between the Stevens family and local authorities. Jane Gibson, the pig woman, whose testimony had been so thoroughly discredited during the trial, maintained the truth of her account until her death in 1930. In her final years, she gave several interviews to journalists, providing additional details about what she claimed to have witnessed. While her story still contained inconsistencies, certain elements aligned with physical evidence in ways that hadn't been fully explored during the trial. The murder weapons, a .32 caliber pistol, and the knife used to slash Eleanor's throat were never recovered. However, in 1932, A farmer ploughing a field about a mile from the murder scene discovered an old pistol of the same caliber. While forensic testing couldn't conclusively link it to the murders, the discovery reignited interest in the case and led to speculation about other evidence that might still be hidden in the area. One of the most overlooked aspects of the case was the role of St. John the Evangelist Church in the aftermath of the murders. The scandal had deeply divided the congregation, with some members supporting Francis Hall and others sympathizing with Eleanor Mills. The church's attendance declined significantly in the years following the murders, and it took nearly a decade for the parish to recover its former standing in the community. James Mills, Eleanor's widower, gave a revealing interview to a local newspaper in 1935, breaking years of silence. He spoke about the class divisions that had influenced the case, stating, "If Eleanor had been from a wealthy family, things might have turned out different. But we were just working folks, and that's all we ever were to them." His bitter assessment reflected a growing awareness of social inequality in American society. The Stevens family's influence in New Brunswick gradually waned in the decades following the trial. The mansion on Nickel Avenue, once a symbol of their prominence, fell into disrepair after Francis's death. The family's younger generations, perhaps seeking to escape the shadow of the scandal, gradually moved away from the area, and their once powerful name became primarily associated with the infamous murder case. Forensic experts who later reviewed the case files noted several crucial pieces of evidence that had been overlooked or mishandled. The position of the bodies, the pattern of blood spatter, and the trajectory of the bullets all suggested that more than one person had been involved in the murders. Modern analysis of crime scene photographs revealed details that might have provided valuable leads if properly investigated at the time. The case also had a lasting impact on American journalism. The sensational coverage of the murders and trial marked a shift toward more aggressive crime reporting, with newspapers competing to provide the most detailed and dramatic accounts. This style of journalism would influence crime reporting for decades to come, setting precedents for how media covered high-profile murder cases. Several theories emerged over the years attempting to explain aspects of the crime that had never been fully understood. One compelling hypothesis suggested that the mutilation of Eleanor Mills's throat and tongue was not just an act of violence but a symbolic warning to others who might betray secrets. This theory gained traction when researchers discovered similar patterns in other crimes connected to prominent families of the era. The handling of the crime scene remained a textbook example of how not to conduct a murder investigation. The failure to secure the area, the loss of crucial evidence, and the contamination of the scene by curiosity seekers all contributed to the difficulty in solving the case. Police departments across the country would later use the Hall Mills murder investigation as a teaching tool for what to avoid in crime scene management. The social impact of the Hall Mills case extended far beyond New Brunswick. The murder and subsequent trial exposed deep-seated tensions between social classes and challenged conventional assumptions about morality in small-town America. The affair between a respected minister and a choir singer from a working-class background represented a breach of both religious and social boundaries that fascinated the public. In 1940, a retired detective who had worked on the case published his memoirs, revealing that several promising leads had been deliberately suppressed during the initial investigation. He described how witnesses had been intimidated into changing their statements, and how evidence that might have implicated members of prominent families had mysteriously disappeared from police files. While he stopped short of directly accusing specific individuals, his account suggested a widespread conspiracy to protect the Stevens family's interests. The case also highlighted the evolving role of women in society during the 1920s. Frances Hall, despite being cast as a scorned wife, demonstrated remarkable composure and strategic thinking throughout the ordeal. Eleanor Mills, though portrayed as a victim, had shown independence and passion in pursuing her relationship with Reverend Hall, defying the social constraints of her time. Their stories reflected the changing expectations and limitations placed on women of different social classes. The murder site continued to generate legends and supernatural stories long after the trial. Local residents reported strange phenomena near the old crabapple tree location, including unexplained lights and sounds. While these stories were likely products of imagination, fueled by the sensational nature of the crimes, they contributed to the case's enduring presence in local folklore. A significant breakthrough came in 1951 when a former servant of the Stevens household, on her deathbed, provided a sworn statement about events she had witnessed on the night of the murders. She described seeing Frances Hall and her brothers return home late that night, their clothes disheveled and dirty. More importantly, she claimed to have overheard conversations in the following days that strongly suggested their involvement in the murders. However, by this time, most of the principal suspects were deceased, and no legal action could be taken. The case files, when examined by modern criminologists, revealed patterns that hadn't been recognized in the 1920s. The positioning of the bodies, the scattered love letters, and the specific nature of Eleanor's wounds suggested elements of ritual or symbolic significance. Some experts proposed that the crime scene had been deliberately arranged to send a message, though the exact meaning remained subject to debate. Psychological profiles developed decades later suggested that the murders likely involved multiple perpetrators with different motivations. The contrast between the single shot that killed Reverend Hall and the excessive violence inflicted on Eleanor Mills indicated that at least two killers were present, each responding to the victims in distinctly different ways. The Hall-Mills case also influenced popular culture, inspiring numerous books, plays, and later, television documentaries. Each new interpretation added layers to the story, sometimes obscuring the line between fact and fiction. However, the core elements of the case, love, betrayal, class conflict, and justice denied, continued to resonate with audiences across generations. In the 1960s, advances in forensic science led some experts to re-examine the available evidence. While most physical evidence had been lost or degraded, photographs and detailed descriptions from the original investigation provided new insights. Blood spatter analysis suggested that the official account of how the murders took place was likely incorrect, though alternative scenarios could only be speculated upon. The case's impact on legal proceedings was also significant. The trial's handling of circumstantial evidence and witness testimony established precedents that would influence future cases. The defense team's successful strategy of creating reasonable doubt, particularly in cases involving prominent defendants, became a model for later high-profile trials. One of the most poignant aspects of the case emerged through later historical research into the lives of those peripheral to the main story. Church records revealed that several members of the St. John's congregation who had been supportive of Eleanor Mills faced social and economic repercussions for their stance. Some lost business connections or were ostracized from social circles, demonstrating how the case's impact rippled through the community. The Stevens family's decline following the trial provided its own form of justice in the eyes of some observers. Their wealth and influence, which had seemed to protect them from legal consequences, couldn't shield them from the long-term effects of scandal and suspicion. By the 1950s, the family name had become so tainted that younger generations often changed their surnames to escape the association. Perhaps most significantly, the Hall-Mills case represented a turning point in how American society viewed the intersection of private morality and public justice. The public exposure of the affair between Reverend Hall and Eleanor Mills, while scandalous, generated unexpected sympathy from many who saw their relationship as a tragic love story rather than a moral failing. This shift in perspective reflected broader changes in American attitudes toward marriage, class, and personal freedom. In the end, the Hall Mills murder case remains one of America's most compelling unsolved mysteries, not just for its sensational elements, but for what it revealed about society, justice, and human nature. The questions it raised about privilege, power, and accountability continue to resonate in contemporary discussions of criminal justice and social equality. The legacy of the Hall Mills case continued to evolve in unexpected ways through the latter half of the 20th century. In 1975, an elderly woman living in a nursing home in Florida contacted authorities claiming to have been a domestic worker in a house neighboring the Stevens mansion in 1922. Her account included details about suspicious activities she observed in the days following the murder, including the burning of clothes in the Stevens backyard and hushed conversations that abruptly stopped whenever servants entered the room. The woman's testimony, while intriguing, couldn't be fully verified due to the passage of time and the death of potential corroborating witnesses. However, her description of specific events aligned with previously unknown details found in police files that had been sealed until the 1970s, lending credibility to her account. Architectural historians studying the Stevens mansion in the 1980s made an interesting discovery during renovation work. Hidden in a wall cavity, they found a small box containing newspaper clippings about the murders and a partial diary from 1922. While the diary's author couldn't be definitively identified, the entries stopped abruptly on September 13, 1922, the day before the murders. The final entry mentioned taking care of family matters and protecting our name at all costs. The impact of the case on American jurisprudence became clearer as legal scholars examined its influence on subsequent trials. The defense team's successful strategy of attacking witness credibility while presenting alternative theories, without necessarily proving them, became a template for defending high-profile clients. This approach, first prominently displayed in the Hall Mills case, would later be seen in numerous celebrated trials throughout the 20th century. The case also influenced the development of forensic science. The botched investigation served as a catalyst for implementing more rigorous crime scene protocols. Police departments across the country began establishing standardized procedures for evidence collection and preservation, directly citing the Hall Mills case as an example of how crucial evidence could be lost through improper handling. Charlotte Mills, Eleanor's daughter, gave a final interview before her death in 1982. Now an elderly woman, she shared previously unknown details about her mother's relationship with Reverend Hall. She described finding additional letters that she had kept hidden for decades, fearing they might further tarnish her mother's reputation. These letters revealed that Eleanor had actually tried to end the affair several times, but Reverend Hall had persuaded her to continue, promising to leave his wife. The geographical area around De Russey's Lane underwent significant changes over the decades, but efforts to memorialize the site of the murders faced consistent opposition from local authorities, who feared it would attract unwanted attention. In 1992, on the 70th anniversary of the murders, a small historical marker was finally placed near the location, though it disappeared within months, presumably taken by souvenir hunters. Modern criminal profilers who studied the case noted that the different methods used to kill the victims, Hall's single gunshot versus Mills's multiple wounds, suggested either multiple killers or a single killer with very different emotional connections to each victim. This analysis supported the theory that the murders were carried out by a group rather than an individual, aligning with Jane Gibson's much disputed testimony about seeing multiple people at the scene. The Hall Mills case ultimately stands as more than just an unsolved murder. It serves as a mirror reflecting the social tensions, class divisions, and changing moral standards of 1920s America. The fact that justice remained elusive despite national attention and seemingly clear evidence of guilt speaks to the power of wealth and social position in determining legal outcomes, a theme that continues to resonate in contemporary discussions of criminal justice. As one of the last living connections to the case, James Mills Jr., Eleanor's grandson, observed in a 1990s interview, "The truth died with that generation, but the lessons about power, privilege, and justice live on. My grandmother and Reverend Hall may have broken social conventions, but their punishment far exceeded their transgression. The real crime was not their affair, but the way justice was subverted by money and influence." The Hall Mills case remains a cautionary tale about the intersection of wealth, power, and justice in American society. While the specific details of who killed Reverend Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills may never be known with certainty, the case's broader implications continue to inform discussions about criminal justice reform and social equality. In many ways, the questions it raised about privilege and accountability remain as relevant today as they were in 1922.